I'd like you all to meet Vanessa, my upgrade, James announced, his voice carrying across the restaurant as he wrapped his arm around the waist of the statuesque blonde. She understands ambition in a way that some people never will. His eyes fixed on me with a mixture of spite and triumph, champagne glass raised in a mockery of a toast on what should have been our 10th anniversary dinner. The shock of his words hung in the air like shattered glass. 10 years of marriage. And this was how it ended, in an upscale restaurant, surrounded by colleagues he'd insisted join our celebration, with his new girlfriend beaming beside him as if she'd won a prize. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat paralyzed, the diamond bracelet I'd bought him, engraved with our wedding date, still wrapped in velvet inside my purse. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something unforgivable happens. The clinking of silverware stops. Conversations die mid-sentence. For 3 excruciating seconds, everyone at our table, his colleagues from the prestigious Westbrook capital firm where he'd just been hired, froze, uncertain how to respond to such a flagrant display of cruelty. Vanessa broke the silence with a practiced laugh. "James told me so much about you," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It's brave how you've been supporting his career all these years." Her fingers, adorned with a ring that looked suspiciously similar to one I'd pointed out in a jewelry store last month, traced patterns on his shoulder. Some women just weren't meant for the executive lifestyle. I felt the weight of every eye at the table, the pity, the discomfort, the secondhand embarrassment, and beneath it all, a silent question. What would I do now? James had calculated everything perfectly. The public setting, the audience of his, new colleagues, the timing. He knew I wouldn't make a scene. I never did. For 10 years, I'd been the supportive wife who stood in the background, who dimmed her own light so his could shine brighter. The wife who had concealed her own ambitions to protect his fragile ego. "Rebecca," he prompted when I remained silent, irritation flashing across his face. "Aren't you going to welcome Vanessa to the family?" Something inside me shifted then, a tectonic plate moving after years of pressure. The restaurant with its ambient lighting and expensive artwork blurred around the edges of my vision as I found myself at a crossroads, collapse inward or stand my ground. I reached for my water glass, buying time as I considered my options. The cool condensation against my fingers anchored me to the moment. James expected tears. He expected pleading. He expected me to disintegrate before his colleagues, confirming everything he'd probably told them about his emotionally unstable wife. Instead, I smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "What an unexpected anniversary gift," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Though I suppose I should have seen it coming after the mysterious late nights at the office. I turned to Vanessa, whose smile faltered slightly. "A word of advice? When he tells you he's working late, check the credit card statements. The Four Seasons shows up as business development on the bill." A man at the far end of the table, Graham Peterson, one of the senior partners at Westbrook, coughed uncomfortably into his napkin. His wife Patricia's eyebrows shot up, her gaze darting between James and me with renewed interest. "Rebecca," James warned, his jaw tightening. "You're embarrassing yourself." "Am I?" I asked, taking a deliberate sip of water. "I thought that was your specialty tonight." Vanessa shifted uneasily, her confident posture slipping for just a moment. Good. Let her see what she was signing up for. "I think we should all enjoy this lovely dinner," James said with forced lightness, turning to the table. "After all, we're celebrating new beginnings. My new position at Westbrook and—" he squeezed Vanessa's waist. "Other new developments." The conversation around the table resumed awkwardly, everyone too polite or too uncomfortable to acknowledge what had just happened. I sat motionless, the food before me untouched, my mind racing beyond the humiliation of the moment to something colder and more calculated. What James didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask during our decade-long marriage, was exactly what I did during those long hours when I was supposedly supporting his career from home. He had assumed I was merely keeping his house, managing his social calendar, being his perfect corporate wife. The truth was far more interesting. I excused myself to the restroom, walking with deliberate steadiness through the restaurant. Only when the heavy door swung shut behind me did I allow my hands to shake. I gripped the marble countertop, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger. Perfectly styled hair, carefully applied makeup, designer dress that James had once complimented as appropriately elegant. All the external trappings of the role I'd been playing. Are you all right? A woman emerged from one of the stalls. Patricia Peterson, the senior partner's wife. Her eyes held genuine concern rather than pity. Perfect, I said, reaching for a paper towel with trembling fingers. Nothing like being publicly discarded on your anniversary to build character. Patricia's mouth tightened. James has always been ambitious. But this... She shook her head. Bringing her to a dinner with firm partners? It's not just cruel to you, it's unprofessional. I laughed without humor. James has always excelled at combining cruelty with career advancement. 2 birds, 1 stone. Rebecca. Patricia hesitated, lowering her voice. Graham speaks very highly of your investment acumen. He mentioned you've consulted on a few matters for him privately. If you ever wanted to turn that into something more formal... The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Here was Patricia Peterson, offering me a professional lifeline minutes after my husband had humiliated me in front of her husband. What she didn't know, what almost no one knew, was how unnecessary her offer was. Thank you, Patricia. That's very kind. I reapplied my lipstick with steady hands, a small act of armor. But I think I'll be just fine. She nodded, seeming to understand that further conversation wasn't welcome. As the door closed behind her, I allowed myself 30 seconds, counting each one silently, to feel the full force of what had just happened. The betrayal, the humiliation, the calculated cruelty of James's timing and method. Then, I straightened my shoulders and made a decision. James had orchestrated tonight as the end of our story, his triumphant exit from a marriage that no longer served his ambitions, with an audience to witness my humiliation. But he had miscalculated. This wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of something he couldn't possibly anticipate. I took out my phone and made a brief call. Michael, it's Rebecca. Remember that contingency plan we discussed? It's time. I paused, listening to his response. Yes, everything. And Michael? I want to be in the office tomorrow morning. It's time everyone met the actual CEO. When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted to James's new position at Westbrook Capital. He was explaining, with practiced modesty, how they had pursued him aggressively for the Director of Acquisitions role. They practically created the position for me, he boasted, seemingly having forgotten or dismissed the earlier tension. Said they needed someone with my particular expertise to handle their most sensitive acquisitions. How fascinating, I commented, sliding back into my seat. And this position reports directly to the CEO? James looked briefly irritated at the interruption. Through the COO, but yes, ultimately to Westbrook's CEO. And have you met this mysterious CEO yet? I asked, taking a sip of my wine. I understand they're quite particular about new executive hires. Graham Peterson looked at me sharply, his expression unreadable. Not yet, James replied dismissively. Apparently they're traveling. I'll meet them next week at the quarterly leadership retreat. He turned back to the table. As I was saying, they've given me considerable latitude with the upcoming Davidson merger. I sat quietly for the remainder of the dinner, observing James in his element, commanding attention, dropping hints about exclusive deals, positioning himself as indispensable to his new firm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Vanessa hung on his every word, playing her role perfectly. The adoring, impressed girlfriend, occasionally shooting triumphant glances in my direction. Little did either of them know that in exactly 9 days, at the Westbrook Capital Leadership Retreat in the Adirondacks, James would be meeting his new CEO, the majority owner who operated behind a wall of holding companies and investment trusts. The woman whose financial acumen had built Westbrook from a mid-sized firm into one of the most respected boutique investment companies on the East Coast. The woman who had specifically approved his hiring, curious to see if the man she had married had grown into someone deserving of the position. The woman he had just publicly discarded as his upgrade sat glittering on his arm. As the evening mercifully drew to a close, James didn't even bother to see if I had a way home. He and Vanessa departed first, his hand possessively on the small of her back as they weaved between tables toward the exit. I watched them go, already, mentally calculating the steps that would unfold over the coming days. "Do you need a ride home, Rebecca?" Graham Peterson asked quietly once they'd gone. His eyes held something more than sympathy, respect, and perhaps a hint of anticipation. "No, thank you, Graham," I replied, gathering my purse. "I have a car waiting, but I appreciate the offer." I paused, then added casually, "I look forward to seeing everyone at the leadership retreat next week." His eyebrows rose slightly before his professional mask returned. "Of course. It should be illuminating." As I walked out of the restaurant into the cool evening air, I felt strangely calm. The humiliation of the evening was already transforming into something else, a clarifying force, burning away the last of my hesitation. For years, I had kept my professional life separate from my marriage, building something of my own while maintaining the facade James needed. The supportive, admiring wife who posed no threat to his ego. That facade had served its purpose, and now it was time to let it fall away completely. James had orchestrated tonight as his grand exit, his declaration of independence from a wife who no longer fit his image of success. What he didn't realize was that he had also freed me from any obligation to protect him, from others, or from himself. My car arrived at the curb, the driver holding the door with professional courtesy. As I settled into the back seat, I opened my calendar app and sent a brief message to my executive team. Meeting tomorrow, 8 a.m. Subject, Westbrook Capital Restructuring, particular focus on the Director of Acquisitions position. For the first time in years, I felt the stirring of something I had almost forgotten. Anticipation, edged with a certain satisfaction. James had always been so concerned with optics, with appearances, with how things looked to others. In 9 days, he would learn just how appearances could deceive. The game he thought he had won was only just beginning. The luxury townhouse I returned to that night felt cavernous in its silence. For 10 years, this carefully curated space had been the backdrop for our marriage. The dinner parties for James's clients, the holiday gatherings, the carefully orchestrated moments that supported the narrative of our perfect life together. Now, walking through the foyer with its gleaming marble floors and tasteful artwork, I saw it differently, as the elaborate set of a play that had finally concluded its run. I slipped off my heels and padded to the kitchen, bypassing the living room where framed photos still displayed our smiling faces from happier times. Our wedding in the Hamptons, a vacation in Santorini, the charity gala where we'd first met. Each image carefully selected to tell the story James wanted to project. Successful man, beautiful wife, enviable life. The kitchen, at least, felt more like mine. James rarely entered this space except to grab coffee on his way out the door. I poured myself a generous glass of the Cabernet he'd deemed too expensive for everyday drinking, and carried it to my private office at the back of the house. This room, with its sleek desk, dual monitors, and wall of business and finance books, was my sanctuary. James had patronizingly called it my little home office when I'd insisted on having it built 5 years ago. He assumed I used it for household management and perhaps the occasional charity committee work. He had never bothered to ask why I needed enterprise-grade security on my computer system or why I often took calls behind its closed door. I settled into my chair and unlocked the hidden compartment in my desk drawer, removing a slim folder containing documents I'd hoped never to use. Divorce contingency plans prepared by my private attorney 3 years ago when James's late nights at the office had first begun. I had suspected then, but chosen to look the other way. Not out of love, that had begun fading years earlier, but out of strategic patience. The night we met flashed through my mind. The Metropolitan Museum Charity Gala, 8 months after I'd quietly founded Keystone Investments with money from my family's trust and 2 silent partners. I was 26, still establishing myself in the financial world under my professional name, my mother's maiden name, Mitchell, while maintaining a separate social identity. James had been charming that night, attentive in a way few men had been once they learned of my financial background. Most were either intimidated or saw me as a prize to be acquired. James, a rising star at his firm, had seemed different, genuinely interested in my thoughts, amusing me with insider stories about Wall Street's absurdities. When he'd asked what I did, I'd given him the simplified version I used at social functions: family business consulting. It wasn't exactly a lie. My family had been in finance for generations, though my father had nearly destroyed that legacy. With a series of disastrous investments before his death, rebuilding from what remained of our family's assets had been my singular focus since graduating from Wharton at 22. James had pursued me relentlessly, and I'd allowed myself to be caught. The marriage made sense at the time. A partner who understood the demands of the financial world but didn't directly compete in my space. Someone who could manage the social aspects of business connections while I built something substantial. Behind the scenes, I'd never intended to keep Keystone a secret from him permanently. In those early days, I had imagined eventually bringing him into my confidence, perhaps even into the business once it was established enough to withstand his ego. But something had shifted during our first year of marriage. "You don't need to work, Becca," he'd said when I mentioned possibly taking a part-time consulting position. "Focus on building our home, our social connections. That's more valuable than whatever entry-level position you'd get." I'd recognized it then, the first glimpse of his need to be the provider, the achiever, the center of our universe. So I'd smiled and agreed, all while continuing to build Keystone through early morning calls, encrypted emails, and charity lunch meetings with business associates. As my company grew, acquiring other investment firms including Westbrook Capital, 3 years ago, so did James's resentment toward what he perceived as my contentment with being just a wife. The more successful he became, the more he seemed to need me to be less ambitious, less independent, less myself. "You've become boring, Rebecca," he'd told me 6 months ago after a dinner party. "All you talk about is household renovations and that book club of yours. My colleagues' wives at least have interesting careers." The irony had been almost painful. That same day, I'd closed a $200 million acquisition that made headlines in the financial press, under the name Elizabeth Mitchell, of course. The fictional book club had been my cover for the board meeting. I took another sip of wine, the full weight of his betrayal settling over me. Not just the affair, I'd suspected that for months, but the calculated humiliation of tonight. He hadn't just wanted to leave me. He'd wanted to destroy me publicly, to position himself as the ambitious success story moving on from his holding him back wife. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael, my COO and one of the few people who knew both sides of my life, Everything in motion for Monday. Security team briefed. Legal standing by. You okay? I typed back. Never better. Prepare the Peterson file too. Graham Peterson, Westbrook's chairman, was one of my earliest supporters when I'd founded Keystone. He'd recognized my potential when many others saw only a young woman playing at business with her family's money. When I'd acquired Westbrook through a holding company, he'd agreed to stay on as the public face of leadership, protecting my privacy while I operated as the unseen CEO. Only a handful of people knew that Elizabeth Mitchell and Rebecca Caldwell were the same person. The separation had been necessary in the beginning. A woman in her 20s trying to be taken seriously in the male-dominated world of high finance needed every advantage. The dual identity had eventually become a strategic asset, allowing me to move between worlds, hearing things that would never be said if people knew who I really was. James had benefited from this arrangement more than he knew. How many doors had opened for him because of connections I'd made? How many insights had he gleaned from casual comments I'd made based on information I shouldn't technically have had? He'd attributed his rapid career advancement to his own brilliance, never once questioning why certain opportunities seemed to fall into his lap at just the right moment, until 3 months ago, when he'd hit a ceiling at his firm. No further advancement forthcoming, no matter how many hours he put in. His frustration had turned to bitterness, then to wandering eyes, first professionally, then personally. When the opportunity at Westbrook had suddenly appeared, he'd seen it as validation of his exceptional talents. He had no idea I'd created the position specifically for him after hearing from mutual friends that his career had stalled. Not out of charity, but curiosity. I wanted to see his unfiltered professional capabilities without the advantages my connections had unknowingly provided. I hadn't anticipated Vanessa, but her appearance had simply accelerated a process already in motion. I closed the folder and returned it to its hiding place. The divorce would proceed, but not until after the leadership retreat. James deserved the full experience of understanding exactly what he had thrown away. Not just a wife, but a business partner whose influence far exceeded anything he had imagined. I finished my wine and moved through the house, systematically removing photos of James and me together, placing them in a box I then stored in the guest room closet. Not out of sentimentality, but evidence preservation, my attorney had been clear about documenting the history of our marriage. In our bedroom, his side of the closet already half empty, I noticed, I changed into silk pajamas and performed my nightly routine with mechanical precision. Tomorrow would require perfect focus and energy. Tonight's humiliation had been James's opening move in what he thought was his endgame. He had no idea we were playing entirely different games. As I slid between the sheets, my phone buzzed one final time with a message from Patricia Peterson. Graham told me everything after dinner. Your secret has been safe with us for years, and still is. But if there's anything you need this week, anything at all, we're here. What James did tonight was unforgivable. I smiled slightly at the unexpected alliance. Patricia had always been perceptive. Thank you. Just be sure to capture his face at the retreat when the truth comes out. Consider it an anniversary gift to replace the one I didn't get tonight. I set my alarm for 5 a.m., my usual wake-up time that James had never once questioned, assuming I spent my mornings on household management before he arose at 7. Tomorrow would mark the first day of James's reckoning, though he wouldn't know it yet. The company-wide email introducing Elizabeth Mitchell as the returning CEO of Westbrook Capital wouldn't name me directly or include a photo. That reveal would wait for the retreat. But it would set the stage for what was to come. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself not angry, but curiously liberated. For years I had maintained the charade of being just James's wife, dimming my own light to keep peace in our marriage. That necessity had now evaporated with the last of his champagne toast to his upgrade. On Monday, I would step fully into the power I had built over the past decade. And in 9 days, James would discover exactly who he had discarded so carelessly. Sometimes, an ending is just the beginning you never saw coming. Dawn arrived with the particular clarity that follows a night of life-altering decisions. I woke before my alarm, the pale light of early morning filtering through the curtains I'd selected years ago to complement James's preference for sleeping late on weekends. Today, their subtle pattern seemed like just another small compromise in a marriage built on them. I moved through my morning routine with practiced efficiency. Shower, hair, makeup applied with the precision of armor. Today I selected a charcoal Armani suit I'd never worn at home, part of my Elizabeth Mitchell wardrobe that hung in a separate closet in my office downtown. The sharp tailoring and subtle power it conveyed belonged to the CEO persona I'd maintained separate from my marriage for a decade. Standing before the full-length mirror, I barely recognized the reflection staring back at me. Not because of the suit. I wore similar attire daily at my actual office, but because of the expression on my face. Gone was the careful mask of supportive wife, the pleasant half-smile I'd perfected for James's business functions. In its place was something harder, clearer, the face of a woman who had finally stopped pretending. "Who are you?" I whispered to my reflection, genuinely curious. For so long I'd compartmentalized my life, Rebecca Caldwell at home, Elizabeth Mitchell in the boardroom, that I'd sometimes lost track of where the performance ended and my authentic self began. Last night's humiliation had torn down that dividing wall. The careful separation I'd maintained between my personal and professional lives had served its purpose, but James had shattered that arrangement with his public cruelty. Now, the woman in the mirror was neither purely Rebecca nor Elizabeth, but something new emerging from both, integrated, undivided, and dangerously clear-eyed. I made coffee in the kitchen, noticing James hadn't returned home last night. His toothbrush was gone from our bathroom, as were several suits from his closet. The swift execution of his exit plan suggested he'd been preparing for this moment for some time, perhaps as long as I'd been preparing for mine. The quiet of the kitchen was interrupted by a text message alert. Vanessa's perfectly made-up face appeared on my phone screen, a social media notification. She'd posted a photo of herself and James from last night, his arm around her waist, champagne glasses raised in a toast. The caption read, "New beginnings with this incredible man. Some people climb the ladder, others are the ladder. So blessed to be with someone who knows the difference. Bond power couple. Moving up." I stared at the image, noting the calculated angle that showcased her diamond bracelet, identical to the one I'd almost given James last night. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was already playing the role of ambitious, man-supportive partner, positioning herself as both trophy and asset to his career, a role I had played myself, though with a dramatically different endgame in mind. The photo ignited something deeper than anger, a profound weariness with the entire charade. How exhausting it had been, maintaining the fiction of the devoted corporate wife while building something significant in the shadows. How many dinner parties had I hosted? How many conversations had I carefully modulated? How many of my own accomplishments had I downplayed to protect James's fragile ego? I closed the social media app and opened my secure email instead. 3. Messages from my executive team awaited response, along with a confidential brief on James's professional history compiled by our HR department when he'd applied for the director position. I had reviewed it before approving his hire, of course, but now I studied it with fresh eyes, seeing the careful embellishments, the strategic omissions, the polished narrative of success that didn't quite align with his actual accomplishments. James was good at what he did. I wouldn't have created a position for him otherwise, but not nearly as exceptional as he believed himself to be. His true talent lay in self-promotion, in creating the impression of indispensability while carefully managing upward. It had worked throughout his career, and he'd assumed it would work at Westbrook as well. What he couldn't have known was that I had been watching his playbook for years, recognizing each move for exactly what it was. The careful cultivation of allies just senior enough to be useful. The strategic undermining of potential rivals through seemingly casual comments. The taking of credit for collaborative successes while distancing himself from failures. I had never called him out on these tactics, partly because they weren't directed at me, and partly because observing them had made me a better executive. James had been my unwitting masterclass in corporate politics, teaching me to recognize manipulation in my own organization and guard against it. Now, sipping coffee in the kitchen that had been the setting for so many performances of domestic harmony, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what I had known subconsciously for years. Our marriage had been a transaction from the beginning. James had wanted a wife who enhanced his professional image, attractive, socially adept, from a good family. I had wanted the cover of convention, a socially acceptable explanation for my frequent absences and early mornings as I built my company. For years, it had been a mutually beneficial arrangement. Only when James began to see me as a limitation rather than an asset had the balance shifted. His growing resentment of what he perceived as my lack of ambition, the very fiction I had maintained to protect his ego, had been the first sign that our unspoken contract was fraying. Last night had been his notice of termination, delivered with calculated cruelty meant to establish his dominance in our new dynamic. He expected me to retreat, wounded and diminished, perhaps begging for reconciliation or at least a dignified divorce settlement. The public humiliation had been designed to establish the narrative from the beginning. Ambitious man moves on from holding him back wife to upgrade to trophy girlfriend who understands his drive. I set down my coffee cup and moved to the window, watching the early morning light illuminate the carefully tended garden behind our home. The property had been purchased with my money, though James believed we'd secured the favorable mortgage through his banking connections. The garden had been designed by a landscape architect he'd insisted we needed to impress his managing director during a summer barbecue 3 years ago. How many aspects of our life together had been constructed as backdrop for his ambitions? And how willingly had I accommodated them while pursuing my own hidden agenda? The realization brought no satisfaction, only a clarifying sadness. We had used each other, certainly, but I had never sought to harm him. Even now, preparing to reveal myself as his ultimate boss, my intention wasn't revenge but simply the removal of a mask that no longer served any purpose. My phone rang, Michael calling for our morning briefing before the executive team meeting. "Good morning, Elizabeth," he said, using my professional name. "Are you coming into the office today?" "Yes," I replied, making a final decision. "It's time to consolidate operations. Have security clear out the downtown apartment this afternoon. I'll be working from home going forward." The downtown apartment, maintained under the name Elizabeth Mitchell, had been my refuge for years, the place where I transformed from Rebecca Caldwell, corporate wife, into Elizabeth Mitchell, CEO. Its necessity had ended last night. "Understood," Michael replied, his tone professional but concerned. "And James? How are you handling that situation?" I considered the question, weighing my personal hurt against my professional responsibilities. "Exactly according to corporate policy," I said finally. "He'll be evaluated on his performance alone, starting today. No special treatment, positive or negative. And the leadership retreat next week? Proceeds as planned. I'll reveal my identity at the beginning of the first session. Make sure Graham is prepared to manage the fallout." After ending the call, I gathered my things: laptop, portfolio, the small overnight bag I kept packed for unexpected business. Trips. As I prepared to leave the house, I paused at the entryway table where a silver-framed photo still stood. James and me on our wedding day, my smile radiant and genuine. I had believed then that our marriage could eventually bridge the divide between my personal and professional lives, that the man I had chosen would be strong enough to celebrate my success rather than feel diminished by it. I had been wrong. placed the photo face down, and walked out the door, locking it behind me. The woman who had left this house yesterday evening, the perfect corporate wife with her anniversary gift and careful makeup, would not be returning. In her place stood someone new, someone who had finally stopped compartmentalizing her power. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, not the sensible luxury sedan James believed I drove, but the high-performance vehicle I actually preferred. I felt a sudden, unexpected sense of freedom. The weight of maintaining dual identities had been heavier than I'd realized. Now, as I navigated the early morning traffic toward Westbrook's headquarters, I felt lighter, sharper, more fully myself than I had in years. James had orchestrated last night as my ending. He had no idea it was actually his beginning, the start, of discovering exactly who he had been married to all these years and what she was capable of. I smiled slightly as I pulled into my reserved parking space, the one marked CEO that had always been kept empty during my frequent travels. Today, it would be filled. Today, Elizabeth Mitchell would step out of the shadows, and in 9 days, James Caldwell would discover exactly what kind of upgrade his wife actually represented. The Westbrook Capitol building stood 42 stories above Manhattan, its glass facade reflecting the morning sunlight. I'd purchased the property 4 years ago through one of my holding companies, another investment James had never questioned despite its prominence in the financial district. Like so many aspects of my life, it had existed in plain sight, yet remained invisible to him because it didn't align with his perception of who I was. Security greeted me with respectful nods as I crossed the marble lobby. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell." The private elevator, reserved for executive leadership, opened with a discreet chime, its operator smiling in recognition. "Welcome back, ma'am. The team is assembled in the boardroom." "Thank you, Davis. How's your daughter doing at Columbia?" He beamed with paternal pride. "Dean's List again. That scholarship program you established made all the difference." These small human connections, knowing my employees, their families, their aspirations, had always been a core aspect of my leadership philosophy. While James networked strategically, cultivating only relationships that offered clear advancement, I built genuine connections throughout every level of my organization. The loyalty this engendered couldn't be purchased or demanded, a lesson James had never learned. The executive floor was already humming with activity despite the early hour. My administrative director, Sophia, intercepted me before I reached the boardroom, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "The company-wide email is drafted for your approval," she said, falling into step beside me. "And your office has been prepared. Will you be taking meetings as Elizabeth Mitchell or—" She hesitated, aware of my dual identity but unsure of my intentions going forward. "As myself," I replied. "Just myself. The distinction ends today." She nodded, professional as always, though I caught the flicker of relief in her eyes. Maintaining my separate identities had complicated operations. For my inner circle, requiring elaborate scheduling arrangements and careful communication protocols. And Mr. Caldwell's orientation? He's scheduled to meet with the acquisitions team at 10. I paused, considering. "Proceed as planned. No special treatment." "Understood. And if he should happen to come to the executive floor?" "He won't," I said, with certainty. James never investigates what he believes he already understands. He'll be focused on impressing his direct reports today, not exploring the executive hierarchy. The boardroom fell silent as I entered, 12 faces turning toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. My executive team, the carefully selected leaders who had helped build Westbrook into what it was today, were among the few who knew both aspects of my life. Michael rose from his chair at the far end of the table. "Good morning, everyone. As you've likely heard, we're navigating an unusual situation." He glanced at me, silently offering the floor. I set my portfolio on the polished table and remained standing, wanting the clarity of this moment to be absolute. Last night, my husband publicly ended our marriage, I said, my voice steady. He's recently been hired as Westbrook's new director of acquisitions, a position he believes reports to a CEO he has yet to meet. A ripple of uncomfortable recognition moved through the room. That meeting is scheduled for the leadership retreat next week. Until then, we will proceed with absolute professionalism. Graham Peterson, seated to my right, cleared his throat. To be clear, you want us to treat him exactly as we would any new executive? No indication of his personal connection? Precisely, I confirmed. James will be evaluated solely on his professional merits. His personal choices are irrelevant to his performance here. And when he discovers your position? This from Diane Levinson, our sharp-eyed general counsel, already anticipating potential legal complications. He'll be given the same options as any executive in his position: adapt to the organizational structure or seek opportunities elsewhere. I surveyed the faces around the table, reading the unasked questions in their expressions. I understand this creates an unusual dynamic. To address the obvious concern, my personal situation will not influence company decisions. James was hired because he has valuable skills our acquisitions team needs. That hasn't changed. What remained unspoken, but understood by everyone in the room, was that James would now have to succeed or fail entirely on his own merits, without the invisible advantages my connections had previously provided. The playing field hadn't been tilted against him. It had simply been leveled. Now, I continued, shifting to business mode, let's discuss the Davidson merger. Michael, where do we stand with regulatory approval? The meeting proceeded efficiently, covering quarterly projections, strategic initiatives, and pressing operational concerns. Throughout the discussion, I felt a growing sense of integration, the artificial barrier between my personal and professional identities dissolving with each minute. This was who I had always been: decisive, strategic, engaged with both the human and financial aspects of business. The performance had been my role as James's wife, not my role as CEO. As the meeting concluded, Graham lingered behind while the others filed out. I've watched you build this company for 10 years, he said once we were alone. Seen you navigate market crashes, regulatory challenges, and attempted hostile takeovers without breaking stride. But I've never seen you like this. Like what? I asked, gathering my notes. Fully present, he replied. There's always been a part of you held in reserve, watching the exits. Now? He gestured vaguely. It's like seeing you in complete focus. For the first time, his observation startled me with its accuracy. I had always maintained a certain distance, not just from James, but from everyone in my life. The necessity of maintaining separate identities had created a habit of partial presence, of keeping something held back. Last night changed things, I acknowledged. When someone tries to publicly diminish you, it clarifies what you're no longer willing to diminish in yourself. Graham nodded thoughtfully. For what it's worth, Patricia and I always hoped you'd eventually find a partner who could celebrate what you've built, not compete with it. James seemed... He paused, choosing his words carefully. More concerned with being seen as successful than with creating actual value. The assessment was both kind and devastatingly accurate. James had pursued the trappings of success, the prestigious address, the social connections, the beautiful wife, while I had focused on building something of lasting significance. Our fundamental values had always been misaligned, a reality I had ignored for the sake of convenience and convention. What will you do after the retreat? Graham asked. Once everything is in the open? I considered the question, realizing I hadn't thought beyond the revelation itself. Rebuild, I said finally, but this time without dividing myself in half to make it work. After Graham left, I walked to the window of the empty boardroom, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. From 40 stories up, the city appeared as a living organism, each building, street, and moving vehicle part of an interconnected system. I had always viewed my life similarly, as a complex network of relationships, obligations, and strategic positions that required constant management. What would it mean to simplify that system? To no longer navigate between Rebecca and Elizabeth, wife and CEO, supportive partner and industry leader? My phone vibrated with an incoming text from James. I hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. Movers coming for my things tomorrow. Sign. The papers when they arrive, and this can be civilized. Don't make it difficult, Rebecca. The breathtaking presumption of it, the assumption that I would simply comply with his demands, sign whatever papers he presented, accommodate his timeline for dismantling our marriage, sparked something between amusement and indignation. For a moment, I imagined responding with the truth. I'm your boss now, James. Perhaps you should reconsider your tone. Instead, I simply wrote, no papers will be signed tomorrow. My attorney will be in touch regarding an equitable settlement. His response came seconds later. Don't play games. You're not equipped for them. I smiled at the irony, slipping the phone back into my pocket without replying. James had always underestimated me. It was the foundation upon which our entire relationship had been built. His certainty that I was not equipped for conflict had allowed me to build an empire while he watched me bake cookies for his office parties. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Sophia entered with a tablet in hand. The company-wide email is ready for your approval, she said, offering me the device. We'll send it at 9 a.m. if you're satisfied with the wording. I reviewed the message, a straightforward announcement that Elizabeth Mitchell, CEO and majority owner of Westbrook Capital, would be returning from extended international work to resume direct leadership of domestic operations. The language was professional and unremarkable, noting that I would be formally introduced to the entire executive team at next week's leadership retreat. No photo was included, no personal details offered, nothing that would alert James to the storm approaching on his horizon. The ordinary corporate announcement contained not a hint of the extraordinary revelation it presaged. Send it, I said, handing back the tablet, and please have my office prepared for the meeting with the investment committee at 11. As Sophia left, I remained by the window, watching the city below. For 10 years, I had built something substantial, while maintaining the fiction that I was merely supporting someone else's ambitions. The compartmentalization had served its purpose, allowing me to move freely between worlds that might otherwise have been closed to me. But James's public rejection had severed that arrangement as surely as if he'd cut a tether. In attempting to diminish me, he had inadvertently freed me from the last constraints of our unspoken agreement. There was a certain poetry to it. His search for an upgrade had released me to finally integrate the fractured aspects of my own life. At precisely 9 a.m., the company-wide email would go out to every Westbrook employee, including the newly hired director of acquisitions. James would read it with the casual disinterest he afforded all corporate communications that didn't directly involve him. He might note the CEO's name without recognition, might even mentally prepare some strategy for impressing this Elizabeth Mitchell when they eventually met. What he couldn't possibly prepare for was the moment, 9 days from now, when he would walk into the leadership retreat and discover that the wife he had so publicly discarded and the boss he so desperately needed to impress were one and the same. I straightened my shoulders and turned from the window, ready to reclaim the boardroom not as someone's wife, but as exactly who I was, the woman who owned the company, the building, and as of last night, her complete self. James had introduced his upgrade to the world yesterday. Next week, I would finally introduce mine. The week following my anniversary passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of avoidance and preparation. James made no attempt to return to the townhouse, communicating exclusively through increasingly terse text messages about property division and settlement terms. Each message carried the unmistakable assumption that I would acquiesce to his demands without question, an assumption I allowed him to maintain for now. At Westbrook, I operated mostly from my private office on the executive floor, a space unknown to the majority of employees. The company-wide email announcing my return had generated the expected buzz of curiosity, but without a photo or detailed biography, most employees, including James, had no reason to connect Elizabeth Mitchell with Rebecca Caldwell. By Thursday, I had established a new rhythm, integrating my previously divided life into a single, coherent identity. The relief of no longer maintaining separate wardrobes, schedules, and personas was profound, like setting down a heavy burden I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten its weight. It was in this state of newfound clarity that I encountered James for the first time since our anniversary dinner. I had just concluded a meeting with our investment committee when I spotted him in the main corridor of the 30th floor, deep in conversation with two members of his acquisitions team. He hadn't seen me yet, giving me a moment to observe him unnoticed. He looked exactly as he always did in professional settings, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his posture conveying casual confidence, one hand gesturing emphatically to underscore whatever point he was making. I recognized the performance instantly. James at his most charming, establishing dominance through selective expertise and carefully calibrated charisma. For a moment, I considered simply turning down another hallway to avoid the encounter. The leadership retreat was only 5 days away. There was no strategic advantage in confronting him now, but something in me rebelled against the idea of altering my path to accommodate his presence, another small adjustment in a decade of such adjustments. Instead, I continued walking directly toward the group, my heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor. The sound drew the attention of one of the acquisitions analysts, a young woman named Taylor who had recently been promoted. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. She had attended several executive briefings and knew exactly who I was. "Miss Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying enough to cause James to turn. "I wasn't aware you were back in New York." James's expression shifted from mild irritation at the interruption to professional interest as he assessed me, a woman he didn't recognize, being addressed with obvious deference by his subordinate. I watched the calculation in his eyes, the quick determination that I must be someone worth impressing. "Just returned this week," I replied to Taylor with a warm smile, then turned to James with professional courtesy. "You must be James Caldwell, our new director of acquisitions." His eyes registered brief surprise that I knew who he was, quickly replaced by the practiced charm he deployed for networking opportunities. "I am indeed," he confirmed, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Elizabeth Mitchell," I said, accepting his handshake with firm precision. "I work closely with the executive team on strategic initiatives." His handshake lingered a moment longer than necessary, an old habit I recognized from countless business functions. James had always been tactile when networking, creating an illusion of immediate connection through physical contact. "Strategic initiatives," he repeated, his tone suggesting both interest and a subtle attempt to place me within the corporate hierarchy. "That sounds intriguingly vague." "The best kinds of strategies often are," I replied with a professional smile, noting how he subtly positioned himself to command the space between us, angling his body to establish dominance in the conversation. It was fascinating to observe his tactics from this new perspective, as a potential business connection rather than his wife. "James has been bringing some interesting perspectives to our Davidson acquisition approach," Taylor offered clearly, trying to highlight her boss's contributions. "I've been reviewing the preliminary work," James added smoothly. "The previous analysis missed several key opportunities for post-merger synergies. I've identified at least 3 areas where we could increase projected returns by nearly 12%. The confidence with which he critiqued work he had barely begun to understand was quintessential James. Bold assertions designed to establish expertise, regardless of whether they were fully supported by facts. In our marriage, I had often nodded, along with such pronouncements. Now, I felt no such obligation. "Interesting," I said, my tone neutral. "The Davidson analysis was actually my project." I'd be curious to hear specifically which synergies you believe were overlooked. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face, quickly masked by renewed confidence. Of course, I'd be happy to walk you through my thinking, perhaps over coffee. I'm still getting to know the key players here. The invitation was classic James, turning a potential challenge into a networking opportunity, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about a new colleague who might influence his standing. I had watched him deploy this exact tactic countless times at industry events. Unfortunately, my schedule is quite full before the leadership retreat, I replied. But I look forward to hearing your detailed analysis there. The Davidson merger will be a central topic of discussion. James's expression shifted subtly. Disappointment at the missed networking opportunity balanced against satisfaction at confirmation that he would be participating in the leadership retreat, a privilege typically reserved for senior executives. I've been looking forward to the retreat, he said, his voice lowered conspiratorially. I understand our mysterious CEO will finally make an appearance. Have you worked with Mitchell long? Any insights on what to expect? The audacity of it, asking me for insider information about myself, almost made me laugh. I caught Taylor's widening eyes and the slight shake of her head, warning James that he was overstepping. I think it's best if you form your own impressions, I said. But a word of advice? Come prepared to defend your analysis with substantial data. Unsupported assertions don't go over well. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, I never make claims I can't back up. The boldness of this lie, spoken directly to someone who had witnessed 10 years of his exaggerations and self-promotion, was breathtaking. In our marriage, I had tactfully overlooked such moments, understanding that his confidence sometimes required gentle maintenance of convenient fictions. Now, I simply met his gaze with calm certainty. I'm glad to hear it. That will serve you well at Westbrook. I nodded politely to the group and continued down the corridor, feeling James's eyes on my back as I walked away. The encounter had been brief but revealing. He had no inkling of my true identity, seeing me only as another potential rung on his professional ladder. My phone vibrated with a text as I reached the elevator. It was from Taylor. Should I be concerned? About what just happened? He's asking me about you now. I smiled slightly, typing back. Not at all. Tell him whatever you like. Except who I actually am. The elevator doors opened, revealing Michael waiting inside. He raised an eyebrow as I entered. I just passed James in the corridor, I explained as the doors closed. He was quite interested in learning more about Elizabeth Mitchell. Michael's lips quirked. And what did you tell him? That I look forward to his detailed analysis of the Davidson merger opportunities he claims to have identified. Michael winced. That's the project you spent 6 months personally structuring. The very one, I confirmed. He believes he's found ways to improve returns by 12% after less than a week on the job. Bold, Michael commented, or foolhardy. With James, those qualities have always existed in close proximity. As we reached the executive floor, Michael hesitated before exiting. Are you sure this is the right approach? Letting him continue in ignorance until the retreat? I considered the question seriously. James thrives on preparation and control. He rehearses important meetings, crafts his image meticulously, plans his strategic responses. Taking away that advantage, having him face this revelation without the opportunity to construct a performance around it, is perhaps the only way to see his authentic professional capabilities. And personally, Michael asked quietly. I stepped out of the elevator, the weight of the question following me. Personally, this is the consequence of his choices. He wanted to publicly discard our marriage in favor of professional advancement and a partner who understands ambition. He's getting exactly what he claimed to want. Back in my office, I found myself reflecting on the encounter. James had looked straight at me, his wife of 10 years, and seen only a networking opportunity, a potential ally in his campaign to conquer Westbrook from within. The complete absence of recognition confirmed what I had long suspected. He had never truly seen me, only the reflection of himself that I had carefully maintained for him. My computer chimed with an incoming email from James Caldwell to Elizabeth Mitchell. I opened it with growing curiosity. Ms. Mitchell, it was a pleasure meeting you this morning. I appreciate your insights regarding the Davidson merger and would welcome the opportunity to discuss my analysis in detail prior to the leadership retreat. While I understand your schedule is busy, even a brief conversation could align our thinking and strengthen Westbrook's negotiating position. I've taken the liberty of attaching some preliminary observations based on my review of the situation. Your feedback would be invaluable. Best regards, James Caldwell, Director of Acquisitions. Attached was a 5-page document outlining his strategic enhancements to the Davidson merger approach. I opened it, curiosity overcoming my initial amusement at his persistence. The analysis was not entirely without merit. James had indeed identified several potential improvements to the integration timeline, though his projected 12% return increase was wildly optimistic. More interesting was how he had packaged relatively standard observations as revolutionary insights, a talent for presentation that had served him well throughout his career. What the document revealed most clearly, however, was his fundamental approach. Finding ways to claim credit for existing work while positioning himself as the solution to problems that hadn't yet been identified. It was the same strategy he had deployed in our marriage, creating narratives where he was always the hero, the visionary, the indispensable factor for success. I closed the document without replying. Let him wonder whether his overture had been well received. The uncertainty would likely drive him to prepare even more thoroughly for the leadership retreat, which could only benefit Westbrook regardless of what happened afterward. My calendar alert chimed, reminding me of my afternoon meeting with legal counsel regarding the divorce. The juxtaposition was jarring, from reviewing James's professional posturing to discussing the dissolution of our marriage in the space of an hour. As I gathered my materials for the meeting, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I answered with, "Professional caution. Elizabeth Mitchell speaking. Ms. Mitchell." A woman's voice, cool and slightly hesitant. "This is Vanessa Lawson. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance." The unexpectedness of it, James's new girlfriend calling my professional line, momentarily left me speechless. "I see," I managed finally. "And how did you get this number, Ms. Lawson?" "James mentioned meeting you today. I did some research. I work in public relations. Finding people is part of my job." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, as was the subtle warning that she had resources and wasn't afraid to use them. "How resourceful," I replied neutrally. "What can I do for you?" "I understand you're involved with the leadership team at Westbrook," she continued. "James is very excited about the retreat next week. I was hoping we might meet for lunch. I always like to know who the key players are in James's professional life." The audacity was almost admirable. Vanessa was deploying the same strategy I had observed countless corporate spouses use over the years, inserting themselves into their partner's professional network, gathering intelligence, creating social connections that could later be leveraged. "I'm afraid my schedule doesn't permit social lunches at the moment," I said, "and I generally maintain a professional separation between work relationships and personal entanglements." "Of course," she replied, her tone cooling further. "I just thought, given your position, you might appreciate the broader context of James's situation. He's going through some personal changes that might affect his focus temporarily." The implication was clear. She was attempting to explain away any potential performance issues by referencing his divorce, while simultaneously establishing herself as his spokesperson and defender. "Ms. Lawson," I said carefully, "let me be very clear. At Westbrook Capital, we evaluate our executives solely on their professional performance. Their personal lives, including who they choose to associate with, are entirely their own business, provided they don't impact company operations. I understand completely, she responded, a new edge in her voice. I just wanted to introduce myself since we'll likely be seeing each other at company functions going forward. James speaks very highly of Westbrook's potential. Westbrook's potential, I repeated, noting the phrasing. Not Westbrook's success or Westbrook's achievements, but its potential, implying room for improvement that James would presumably provide. Well, thank you for the call, Ms. Lawson. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to meet eventually. I ended the conversation as politely as efficiency allowed, making a mental note to have our security team review our communication protocols. If Vanessa had obtained my direct line, other sensitive information might also be compromised. The call left me with an unsettled feeling I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't jealousy. Whatever emotional attachment I'd felt toward James had been systematically dismantled by years of his subtle undermining, capped by his public humiliation strategy. Rather, it was the recognition of a pattern being repeated. Vanessa was positioning herself exactly as I had once done, as the supportive partner facilitating James's ambitions. Did she know what that role would cost her over time? The constant modulation of her own aspirations, the careful management of his ego, the strategic deployment of her connections for his benefit? For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered her smirking presence at my anniversary dinner, her deliberate participation in my public humiliation, her calculated comment about women supporting careers versus understanding ambition. She had made her choice with eyes wide open, positioning herself as an upgrade to a wife she believed was inconsequential. In 5 days, both she and James would discover just how profound their miscalculation had been. I gathered my materials and headed to the legal meeting, a new resolve strengthening my steps. The encounter with James and the call from Vanessa had clarified something I had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. The leadership retreat wasn't just about professional revelation. It was about reclaiming narrative control from people who had attempted to define me without consent. James had cast me as the discarded wife, Vanessa as the outmoded predecessor. Neither had bothered to look beyond the role they had assigned me to see who I actually was. Their mistake wasn't in leaving me behind. It was in failing to recognize I had never been where they thought I was in the first place. The Westbrook Leadership Retreat had been a cornerstone of company culture since long before my acquisition of the firm. Held annually at a secluded lodge in the Adirondacks, it combined strategic planning with team-building exercises designed to strengthen relationships among the executive team. This year, the 3-day event carried additional significance as the formal introduction of Elizabeth Mitchell as the active CEO to those who hadn't yet worked directly with me. I arrived at the lodge a day early, using the time to review my presentation materials and confirm the weekend's arrangements with the event coordinator. The setting was deliberately intimate, a grand main lodge surrounded by private cabins, all nestled among towering pines at the edge of a pristine lake. The isolation fostered focus, eliminating the distractions of Manhattan and creating a space where professional relationships could develop outside the constraints of corporate hierarchy. Graham Peterson joined me for dinner at the main lodge, the two of us choosing a quiet table overlooking the water. At 63, Graham had been instrumental in shepherding Westbrook through its evolution from traditional investment firm to innovative financial leader. His public role as chairman had protected my privacy during the critical growth years, and his mentorship had helped me navigate the complexities of an industry still dominated by men's clubs and old boy networks. Everything's prepared for tomorrow, he said, carefully cutting his steak. Michaels arranged the seating for the opening session. James will be positioned at the far end of the table. Good sightline for the cameras. I raised an eyebrow. Cameras? Graham's expression remained innocent. Patricia insisted we record the opening session for the company archives. Historical significance, she said. I smiled despite myself. Patricia Peterson's determination to document James's comeuppance was a small but satisfying reminder that I wasn't the only one he had underestimated over the years. "And how is our new director of acquisitions performing?" I asked, turning the conversation to business. Graham considered the question carefully. "Aggressively competent," he said finally. "He's made quite an impression on his team, working long hours, pushing for faster analysis, positioning himself as the driving force behind the Davidson merger. Has he managed to substantiate those 12% increased returns he promised?" Graham's lips twitched. "He's walked that back to potential increases of up to 8% depending on implementation timing. Still optimistic, but at least within the realm of theoretical possibility." I nodded, unsurprised. James had always been adept at adjusting, his claims when challenged, presenting the revised targets as if they had been his position all along. "And his personal situation?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Quite visible," Graham replied delicately. "Ms. Lawson has been a frequent visitor to the office, joining him for lunch, bringing by forgotten items. She's quite strategic about establishing her presence." The information aligned with what I had gathered from other sources. Vanessa was deliberately integrating herself into James's professional environment, ensuring everyone recognized her as his chosen partner. It was a calculated approach to personal branding that I might have admired under different circumstances. "The executive team arrives at 10 tomorrow," Graham continued. "James is scheduled for 11, along with the other department directors. The opening session begins at noon, with your formal introduction as the first item on the agenda." I nodded, visualizing the sequence of events that would unfold. "And everyone has been briefed on the protocol?" "Absolute confidentiality until your formal introduction," Graham confirmed, "though I must say keeping this particular secret has generated more anticipation than our last 3 product launches combined." After dinner, I retired to my private cabin to review my presentation once more. The material was straightforward: quarterly results, strategic priorities, market positioning, standard CEO communication executed with precision and clarity. What made this presentation unique was not its content, but its context. The revelation of my identity to a man who believed he had left me behind. As I sat on the cabin's porch, listening to the gentle lap of lake water against the shore, I found myself questioning my motivations with renewed intensity. Was this carefully orchestrated revelation truly about professional necessity, or was it driven by personal vindication? Had I structured this entire scenario simply to see the look on James's face when he realized the truth? The question deserved honest examination. I had told myself, and others, that this approach was strategically sound, allowing James to demonstrate his unfiltered professional capabilities before the complication of our personal history emerged. But there were other approaches I could have taken, a private disclosure before the retreat, for instance, or a delayed revelation after he had settled into the role. Instead, I had chosen this path, a public unveiling in front of the entire executive leadership. The decision carried undeniable theatrical elements that served no purely business purpose. The realization didn't shame me, but it did clarify something important. This moment of revelation wasn't just about James discovering who I was. It was about me fully claiming who I had become. After years of compartmentalizing my life to accommodate his ego, I was choosing to stand wholly in my power, without apology or dilution. Yes, there would be satisfaction in watching James confront the reality he had so carelessly dismissed. But the deeper victory wasn't in his reaction. It was in my integration, my refusal to continue diminishing myself to make others comfortable. With that clarity, I closed my presentation materials and prepared for the morning, sleeping more soundly than I had since the night of the anniversary dinner. The executive team began arriving shortly after breakfast, each member stopping by my cabin to check in before settling into their own accommodations. By 11, the property was alive with activity, senior leaders gathering in small groups on the main lodge porch, staff preparing the conference room for the opening session, caterers arranging the welcome lunch. I remained in my cabin, reviewing the final attendance list Michael had sent over. James's name appeared under Directors and Senior Management, his arrival confirmed for 11:05 a.m. A handwritten note in the margin indicated he would be accompanied by Vanessa Lawson, listed as his personal guest for the welcome lunch, and unusual choice for a business retreat, but one I had intentionally allowed when the request was submitted. At precisely 11:45, I made my way to the conference center, choosing a path that avoided the main lodge where arrivals were gathering for pre-session networking. Michael met me at the side entrance, his expression a mixture of professional composure and barely concealed anticipation. "Everyone's in position," he reported. "James arrived with Ms. Lawson approximately 30 minutes ago. They're currently on the main deck, where he's introducing her to the regional directors. And the seating arrangement? As planned. You'll enter from the left after Graham's introduction. James is seated at the far right, giving you a clear line of sight across the table." I nodded, making a final adjustment to my suit jacket. "Has he asked about Elizabeth Mitchell?" Michael's lips quirked slightly. "Repeatedly. He's been working the room, trying to determine who you are and whether you've arrived yet. Several people have indicated you're around somewhere, but keeping a low profile before the formal introduction." The predictability of James's behavior was almost comforting, networking aggressively, gathering intelligence, positioning himself advantageously before an important meeting. These were the tactics that had served him well throughout his career, the careful preparations that allowed him to present the polished, confident persona he had cultivated. Today, those preparations would be rendered useless by a single revelation. "It's time," Michael said, checking his watch. "Graham is beginning the welcome now." We moved through the corridor to the conference room's side entrance, pausing just outside the door. Through the small window, I could see Graham standing at the head of the long table, welcoming the assembled executive team to the retreat. The room was arranged in typical boardroom fashion, a massive oak table surrounded by leather chairs, with Graham at the head position and 24 executives arrayed along both sides. James sat near the far end, his posture conveying casual confidence, one arm draped over the empty chair beside him, presumably saved for Vanessa, who would join for lunch after the business portion concluded. Even from this distance, I could read his expression, alert, engaged, but with that hint of calculation I knew so well, mentally mapping the power dynamics in the room. Graham's voice carried clearly through the door. "Extremely pleased to formally introduce our CEO and majority owner, who has returned from an extended period overseeing our international operations to take a more active role in Westbrook's domestic strategy." I took a deep breath, centering myself in the moment. This wasn't about James, I reminded myself. This was about stepping fully into the life I had built, claiming the achievement that had always been mine. "Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Mitchell," Graham concluded, turning toward the side door. Michael opened it, and I walked into the conference room with measured steps. The assembled executives, most of whom had worked with me for years, rose in a wave of practiced professional courtesy. I moved to the head of the table, accepting Graham's handshake and taking the position he vacated. My eyes found James immediately, watching as confusion gave way to disbelief on his face. He had half risen with the others, his movement arrested, mid-stand as recognition dawned. For 3 breathtaking seconds, his carefully constructed professional mask dissolved completely, revealing raw, unfiltered shock. "Thank you, Graham," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily across the silent room. "And thank you all for being here today. For those I haven't yet had the pleasure of working with directly, I'm Elizabeth Mitchell, CEO and principal owner of Westbrook Capital." I paused, allowing my gaze to move deliberately around the table, including each person in the room before finally returning to James, who had managed to complete his rise to standing, though his knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table. "Some of you may know me by another name," I continued evenly. "In my personal life, I'm Rebecca Caldwell." The ripple of reaction through the room was subtle but unmistakable. Those who hadn't known exchanging glances of surprise, those who had watching James with barely concealed interest. To his credit, he maintained his composure, though the color had drained from his face entirely. For the past decade, I've maintained separate professional and personal identities for a variety of reasons, some strategic, some cultural, some simply practical. That separation ends today. I opened my portfolio, signaling a shift to business. Now, let's discuss Westbrook's position and our strategies for the coming quarter. The meeting proceeded with professional efficiency, each executive presenting their department updates while I facilitated discussion and provided strategic direction. Throughout the presentation, James remained silent, his earlier networking confidence replaced by a stillness that bordered on rigidity. I neither avoided him nor singled him out, treating him exactly as I did every other director in the room, with professional courtesy and appropriate attention to his departmental concerns. When the Davidson merger appeared on the agenda, I acknowledged his team's contributions to the analysis without specific reference to our previous interaction. Only once did our eyes meet directly, during Michael's presentation on organizational structure, when a slide displayed the executive reporting lines with James's position, clearly subordinate to both Michael and me. In that moment of eye contact, I saw something shift in his expression, the shock giving way to calculation as he began processing the full implications of his new reality. As the meeting concluded and executives began gathering their materials, I made a final announcement. "Thank you all for your attention today. We'll reconvene after lunch to discuss the Davidson merger in greater detail. Department directors, please ensure your teams have prepared their implementation timelines as previously requested." The room emptied gradually, executives stopping to exchange brief words with me before heading to the dining room for lunch. James remained seated, his eyes fixed on the table before him, clearly wrestling with his next move. When only the two of us remained, he finally looked up, his expression carefully composed into something approaching professional neutrality. "I think," he said quietly, "we should talk." I closed my portfolio and considered him across the length of the conference table. The man who had publicly discarded me a week earlier, now reconsidering his position in light of new information. "Yes," I agreed, my tone measured. "I believe we should." The conference room emptied, leaving James and me alone in a silence heavy with unspoken recriminations. Through the large windows, I could see executives gathering on the lodge's expansive deck, their curious glances occasionally drifting toward the conference room before quickly averting when they realized they might be observed. James remained, seated at the far end of the table, his initial shock now giving way to the careful calculation I recognized from countless negotiations. I made no move to approach him, instead organizing my presentation materials with unhurried precision. Let him come to me, I decided. Let him traverse the physical distance he had created between us. After what seemed like minutes but was likely only seconds, he stood and walked toward me, each step measured as if approaching an unexploded device. He chose a chair 3 seats away, close enough for private conversation, but maintaining a buffer that spoke volumes about his uncertainty. "You're Elizabeth Mitchell," he said finally, his voice flat with disbelief, despite having had nearly an hour to process this reality. "I am," I confirmed simply. "For how long?" The question came quickly, an edge of accusation beneath the words. "I founded Keystone Investments, Westbrook's parent company, 11 years ago, shortly before we met. The name Elizabeth Mitchell is from my maternal grandmother." His eyes narrowed, processing implications with the rapid calculation that had always made him effective in crisis scenarios. "The entire time we were married, you were running a major investment firm without telling me." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes. Why? The single word carried layers of incredulity. Why the secrecy? Why the separate identity? I considered the question carefully, wanting to be precise in my response. Initially, it was a pragmatic business decision. A 26-year-old woman trying to raise capital and be taken seriously in finance faces certain obstacles. Using my mother's maiden name and being deliberately vague about my age helped bypass some of those barriers. And later, he pressed, after we were married? After you'd established yourself? I met his gaze directly. Later, it became clear that our marriage functioned best when you believed your career was the primary focus of our household. The truth of this statement hit its mark with devastating accuracy. James flinched slightly, then quickly masked the reaction with a scoff. So this was all some elaborate test? Setting me up to fail? No, James. This was me building something substantial, while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that seemed necessary for our marriage to function. You never asked about my charity work or book club meetings. You never questioned why I needed a dedicated home office with enterprise-grade security. You simply assumed I was occupied with activities that posed no threat to your self-image. Leaned back, his expression hardening. And my position here? Was that part of your plan all along? Hiring your soon-to-be ex-husband without disclosing your relationship? You were hired because your qualifications matched what Westbrook needed, I replied evenly. The position was created based on legitimate business requirements. Your application was evaluated by HR and the acquisitions team before reaching my desk. I simply approved their recommendation. How generous of you, he said, sarcasm edging his tone. And were you planning to disclose your identity before or after the divorce was finalized? Today was always the plan. Leadership retreats have traditionally been when Westbrook executives meet the CEO. The timing of our personal situation accelerated nothing. James stood abruptly, pacing alongside the conference table. The controlled movement was familiar, his way of managing frustration when a negotiation wasn't proceeding as anticipated. I remained seated, watching his process unfold exactly as it always did. Initial disbelief, searching for leverage, recalculating his position. You've made me look like a fool, he said finally, turning to face me. In front of the entire executive team. No, James, I corrected quietly. You did that yourself when you introduced your upgrade at our anniversary dinner. The reference to that night hit him like a physical blow, cutting through his professional indignation to the personal betrayal beneath. For a moment, genuine emotion broke through his careful facade. A flash of shame quickly suppressed. That was personal, he said dismissively. This is business. Is it? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, you've made our personal situation very much a business matter by bringing Vanessa to this retreat. She's waiting for you right now, isn't she? Ready to play the supportive partner role at the welcome lunch? His jaw tightened. Vanessa has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this, I countered. You positioned her as my replacement, James. As an upgrade who understands ambition in ways I supposedly don't. You made claims about me, about my capabilities and aspirations, that were fundamentally false, and you did so publicly, with deliberate cruelty. I didn't know, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. How could I possibly have known who you really were? That's exactly the point, I said, my calm unbroken. You never asked. In 10 years of marriage, you never once looked beyond the carefully curated image you had of me, the supportive wife who existed to advance your ambitions. Even when evidence contradicted that image, you dismissed it rather than questioning your assumptions. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I had seen countless times during our marriage. So what now? You're my boss. I'm your subordinate, and we're getting divorced. Is this your idea of professional, of appropriate corporate governance? The attempt to shift from personal accountability to corporate ethics was predictable, moving the battlefield to terrain where he felt more confident. Your position reports to Michael Davis, the COO, I stated factually. While I understand the unusual nature of this situation, there is no direct reporting relationship between us. The board has been fully briefed on the circumstances and approved temporary governance adjustments to manage any potential conflicts. You've thought of everything, he said, bitterness edging his words. That's literally my job, I replied simply. Just as it's been for the past decade, while you believed I was planning dinner parties and charity auctions. James paced to the window, staring out at the assembled executives on the deck. From his vantage point, he could undoubtedly see Vanessa, among them, attempting to network while processing the sudden, dramatic shift in her strategic position. She's going to leave me, he said suddenly, the words seemingly emerging without his permission. The unexpected vulnerability of the statement caught me off guard. Not once in our decade of marriage had James admitted the fear of abandonment that drove so many of his actions. Vanessa? I asked, though I knew exactly who he meant. He nodded without turning from the window. She wanted the ambitious executive, on the rise. The man who could discard his holding him back wife and upgrade to a partner who matched his trajectory. Now I'm the idiot who didn't know his wife owned his company. The punchline to a corporate joke. For a fleeting moment, I felt an echo of the empathy that had once bound us together, the recognition of his fundamental insecurity beneath the confident exterior. Then I remembered the calculated cruelty of his public dismissal, the deliberate humiliation he had orchestrated, and my momentary compassion hardened into something more resolute. Your relationship with Vanessa is not my concern, I said. But I would note that if she leaves because your professional standing has been compromised, she's proving my point rather than yours. A partner who values your status over your character was never an upgrade in any meaningful sense. He turned from the window, his expression tightening back into professional neutrality. What exactly do you want from me, Rebecca? Or should I call you Elizabeth now? What I want is irrelevant to your professional responsibilities, I replied. You were hired to lead the acquisitions team because your skills are valuable to Westbrook. That assessment hasn't changed because of our personal situation. So I should just… What? Pretend this morning never happened? Go back to work as if my wife isn't secretly the CEO who approved my hiring? Not secretly, I corrected. Not anymore. And what you do next is entirely your decision. You can resign if you find the situation untenable. You can request a transfer to one of our regional offices if you prefer more distance. Or you can demonstrate the professional capabilities that earned you this position in the first place. James studied me, with the careful attention he typically reserved for complex negotiations, searching for hidden motivations behind my measured words. You want me to stay, he said finally, realization dawning. This isn't about humiliating me. You actually want me to continue in this role. I allowed a small, precise smile. What I want is for Westbrook to retain valuable talent, regardless of personal complications. Your performance this week, while you believed you were impressing an unknown CEO, demonstrated genuine capabilities. Those capabilities remain useful to this organization. Even after what happened at the anniversary dinner, the question contained a note of genuine puzzlement, as if he couldn't reconcile my professional assessment with his personal actions. Business and personal are separate considerations, I said. I've maintained that separation for years. The question is whether you can do the same. He laughed without humor. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, I acknowledged. But it is. Clear. Your professional value hasn't changed because of our personal circumstances. What has changed is your understanding of the actual power dynamics at play. James moved back to the conference table, resting his hands on the polished wood, as if Seeking stability. All those years, he said quietly. All those nights I came home talking about my deals, my achievements, my career trajectory. You were running a company worth billions. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? The question hung between us, deceptively simple, yet impossibly complex. I considered deflecting with practicalities about professional separation or strategic necessity, but the moment called for something more fundamental. Because you needed me to be less than you are, I said finally. Your confidence required my subordination. The moment I surpassed your achievements, which I already had when we met, you would have seen me as competition rather than partner. His instinct was to deny it. I could see the rejection forming on his lips. But something stopped him. Perhaps. The realization that our current circumstances proved my point more eloquently than any argument could. I would have adjusted, he said instead, though his tone lacked conviction. Would you? I challenged gently. When I suggested taking a part-time consulting role in our first year of marriage, you immediately discouraged it. When my friend Lauren started her own business, you called her aggressively ambitious and questioned her priorities. Every woman in your professional circle who demonstrated significant achievement became someone to critique rather than admire. He had no response to this, perhaps recognizing the pattern for the first time himself. Your professional identity has always been built on being exceptional, I continued. The star performer, the indispensable talent, the one moving fastest, up the ladder. My success threatened that narrative, so I kept it separate to preserve both my company and our marriage. And now? He asked, his voice subdued. What's the end game here? Professionally? You do your job, I do mine, and Westbrook benefits from both our talents. Personally? I spread my hands in a gesture of finality. That book is closed, James. You made that decision very publicly last week. His expression hardened. So this was revenge, making me look foolish in front of the entire executive team. No, I corrected firmly. This was scheduled months ago, before you ever interviewed for the position. Your timing with Vanessa created this particular scenario, not mine. A knock at the conference room door interrupted whatever response he might have made. Michael entered. With a deliberate lack of haste, his expression professionally neutral despite the obvious tension in the room. Excuse me, he said. The lunch service is beginning, and several executives have questions about the afternoon session. Thank you, Michael, I replied, gathering my materials. I'll join them momentarily. James straightened, adjusting his tie in an unconscious gesture of composure. And Ms. Lawson? She's still at the retreat as my guest. I considered this briefly. That's your decision. If you feel her presence is appropriate under the circumstances, she's welcome to stay. The subtle challenge in my words wasn't lost on him. Having Vanessa remain would force him to navigate introduction of his upgrade to his newly revealed boss wife, a social complexity that would test even his considerable interpersonal skills. I think, he said carefully, it might be best if she returned to the city this afternoon. I nodded without comment, neither approving nor questioning his choice. As I moved toward the door, James's voice stopped me. What was real? He asked. The question bare of pretense for perhaps the first time in our relationship. In our marriage. Was any of it genuine? I turned back, finding unexpected honesty in his expression. For a moment, the calculated networker and status-seeking executive were gone, leaving only the man I had once believed I could build a life with. My hope was real, I said quietly. My belief that eventually we could be true partners, that you would become secure enough in your own achievements to celebrate mine. That hope faded gradually, replaced by the pragmatic recognition that our marriage worked precisely because you didn't know who I really was. He absorbed this with a slight nod, neither accepting nor rejecting the assessment. And now everyone knows. Yes, I agreed. Now everyone knows. As I left the conference room, I felt the weight of his gaze following me. not with anger or calculation now, but with something closer to genuine reckoning. For perhaps the first time, James was seeing me clearly, without the distorting lens, of his own needs and assumptions. Outside, the executive team waited on the lodge deck, conversations pausing briefly as I emerged. Among them stood Vanessa, her confident posture now uncertain, her networking smile faltering as she registered the gravity of conversations happening around her. Graham Peterson approached, offering a glass of sparkling water with a subtle nod of support. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. "Professional boundaries established," I replied, matching his discretion. "Personal consequences acknowledged." Graham's eyes moved past me to where James now exited the conference room, his expression carefully composed into professional neutrality despite the seismic shift in his circumstances. "And Mr. Caldwell?" Graham asked. I watched as James made his way directly to Vanessa, bending to speak quietly in her ear. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, her eyes darting to me with sudden recognition. "Making difficult decisions," I observed, "about what kind of man he wants to be going forward." As the group moved toward the dining room for lunch, I caught fragments of conversation around me, speculation about what had transpired in the conference room, assessments of James's future with the company, theories about our marriage and its dissolution. For once, I made no effort to manage these narratives. The truth, in all its complicated reality, was finally sufficient. The game of perception that had defined our relationship for a decade had ended. What remained was the straightforward reality that James had been avoiding since the moment we met. I had always been more than he imagined, and his failure to see it had ultimately cost him everything he genuinely valued. The remainder of the retreat's first day proceeded with professional efficiency, though an undercurrent of fascination rippled through every session. Executives who had known my dual identity for years maintained admirable composure, while those newly informed struggled to reconcile the revelation with their previous understanding of corporate hierarchy. James remained for the afternoon sessions, his contributions carefully measured and strictly professional. If executives were watching for signs of personal distress or resentment, he provided none, demonstrating the compartmentalization skills that had served him well throughout his career. The only visible change in circumstances was Vanessa's absence. She had departed shortly after lunch, a car arranged to take her back to Manhattan with minimal disruption to the retreat schedule. By evening, as executives gathered for the welcome dinner in the lodge's grand dining room, I had settled into a new equilibrium, no longer maintaining the exhausting separation between personal and professional identities, simply existing as myself in all contexts. The relief of this integration was profound, like setting down a heavy burden I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten its weight. I was reviewing the next day's agenda with Michael when I felt a familiar presence at my elbow. James, dressed impeccably, for dinner, his expression pleasant and professionally engaged. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his tone pitched to carry just far enough for those nearby to hear. "I was hoping we might discuss the implementation timeline for the Davidson integration. I've had some thoughts about streamlining the process. The deliberate use of my professional name, the careful positioning of our interaction as purely business-focused. It was classic James, reframing our dynamic on terms he found more favorable. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell," I replied, matching his professional tone. "Perhaps after dinner. The lake path is quite pleasant for walking conversations." His momentary surprise at my easy acceptance was quickly masked with a nod. "That would be perfect. Thank you." As he moved away to speak with another executive, Michael raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's wise?" he asked quietly. "Necessary, not wise," I corrected. "Better to address whatever he's planning directly than allow it to fester." Dinner proceeded pleasantly, with the initial shock of the morning's revelation giving way to more routine business discussions. I purposely seated myself at a table with regional directors, away from both James and the executive team members who knew our history best. The conversation remained focused on business opportunities and strategic initiatives, precisely as it should at a leadership retreat. As coffee and dessert were served, I excused myself, indicating I needed to prepare for the following day's presentations. James caught my eye across the room, a subtle nod confirming our planned conversation. 20 minutes later, I made my way to the lakeshore path, a well-lit trail that curved along the water's edge before looping back to the main lodge. James was already waiting, standing at the trailhead with his hands in his pockets, gazing out over the darkened lake. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, creating a scene of deceptive tranquility. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as I approached, his tone softer than the professional cadence he'd used earlier. "You mentioned the Davidson timeline," I prompted, indicating we should walk. We fell into step along the path, maintaining a professional distance between us. For several moments, James said nothing, seemingly gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice held none of the business focus he'd projected at dinner. "I spoke with Vanessa during her drive back to the city," he said. "She's reconsidering our relationship." I said nothing, waiting for him to reach his actual point. This wasn't about Davidson's implementation timeline, and we both knew it. "She feels I misrepresented my position at Westbrook," he continued, a note of practiced vulnerability entering his voice, "that I led her to believe I had more authority than I actually do." "Did you?" I asked simply. He shrugged, the gesture admitting more than his words. I emphasized the possibilities of the role rather than its current limitations. We walked in, silence for another stretch of path, the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore filling the space between us. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," James finally continued, "about me needing you to be less than you are. There might be some truth to that." The admission, partial as it was, surprised me. James rarely acknowledged personal shortcomings, preferring to reframe narratives in ways that preserved his self-image. "But I also think," he added carefully, "that we have an opportunity here." "An opportunity?" I repeated, instantly alert to the shift in his approach. "Our personal relationship may be over, but professionally, we could be quite effective together." His tone warmed, shifting into the persuasive cadence he used for pitching investment concepts. "Your strategic vision combined with my implementation skills, we could accelerate Westbrook's growth significantly." I remained silent, recognizing the familiar pattern unfolding. This was James's standard recovery technique, acknowledging just enough fault to appear reflective while simultaneously positioning himself as an essential ally moving forward. "The Davidson merger is just the beginning," he continued, enthusiasm entering his voice. "With your backing and my execution, we could target acquisitions that would transform Westbrook's market position within 18 months. "And what exactly are you proposing?" I asked, my tone neutral. He stopped walking, turning to face me directly. In the fading light, his expression held the earnest intensity that had once made him so compelling in negotiations. "A professional partnership," he said. "You as the strategic visionary, me as your implementation specialist. We expand my role to work directly with you on high-priority acquisitions, bypassing some of the more cumbersome approval processes." And there it was, the actual proposal beneath the relationship analysis and professional flattery. James wanted to leverage our past connection to advance his position at Westbrook, creating a special role that would elevate him above his peers and the normal organizational structure. "That's an interesting suggestion," I said carefully, "though it raises obvious governance concerns, which could be addressed through appropriate disclosures and oversight mechanisms," he countered quickly. "The point is, we have a unique opportunity to create value from our unusual situation." I resumed walking, considering how best to respond to his transparent attempt at manipulation. The James of a week ago, before he knew my true identity, would never have proposed such a partnership. This wasn't about recognizing my capabilities. It was about salvaging his position through strategic alliance with the power he had only just discovered. You know what's most interesting about this conversation? I said finally. A week ago, you were introducing Vanessa as your upgrade, because she understands ambition in ways I supposedly didn't. Now you're proposing we leverage my strategic vision and your implementation skills as complementary strengths. James had the grace to look momentarily discomfited before recovering his composure. I've learned a great deal in the past 24 hours, he offered, his tone carefully modulated to convey humility without weakness. What you've learned, I corrected gently, is that I have power you didn't recognize. That realization hasn't changed your fundamental approach, only your target. When you thought I was just your wife, you discarded me for a partner who better served your ambitions. Now that you know I'm your CEO, you're proposing a partnership that would serve those same ambitions. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That's an unfair characterization. I'm simply identifying a professional opportunity that could benefit Westbrook. No, James, I said, stopping to face him directly. You're attempting to leverage our past relationship to create special circumstances for yourself, the same way you've leveraged every relationship throughout your career, not for mutual benefit, but for your personal advancement. For a moment, genuine frustration broke through his carefully maintained facade. What do you want from me? He demanded, his voice rising slightly. I'm trying to find a way forward here. What I want, I replied evenly, is for you to do the job you were hired to do, within the organizational structure that exists for every other director at Westbrook. No special access, no bypassed processes, no preferential treatment. Even though we have a decade of history that could make us more effective together. That history is precisely why such an arrangement would be inappropriate, I countered. Our professional relationship needs more separation, not less. James ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of genuine agitation. So you're determined to keep me at arm's length professionally because of what happened personally? No, I corrected firmly. I'm determined to maintain appropriate corporate governance regardless of our personal history. The same standards apply to you as to every other executive at Westbrook. We had completed the lake loop, arriving back at the path that led to the main lodge. James paused, visibly recalculating his approach as he had so many times during our marriage when his initial strategy failed to yield the desired outcome. I understand, he said finally, his tone shifting back to professional courtesy. Thank you for the clarity. I'll focus on my departmental responsibilities and the standard reporting structure. The easy capitulation was suspicious. James never abandoned a negotiating position without securing some concession. But his expression revealed nothing beyond polite acceptance, his professional mask firmly back in place. Is there anything else we need to discuss before tomorrow's sessions? I asked, maintaining the business focus he now seemed to prefer. Just one thing, he said, his tone deliberately casual. I received a call from Madison Lambert at Goldman this afternoon. They're apparently quite interested in my perspective on potential acquisition targets in the fintech space. The implied threat was clear. If Westbrook wouldn't provide the advancement opportunities he sought, other firms would. It was another familiar tactic, one he had deployed throughout his career when negotiations stalled, creating the perception of external demand to increase his internal value. Madison is excellent at identifying talent, I acknowledged, neither discouraging nor encouraging the implied opportunity. You should always explore options that align with your career goals. My neutral response clearly wasn't what he had anticipated. James studied me for a moment, perhaps searching for signs of concern or possessiveness that would indicate his leverage tactic had succeeded. I'll see you at tomorrow's session then, he said finally, nodding a professional goodbye before turning toward the lodge. I remained by the lake a few minutes longer, watching his retreating figure and reflecting on the predictability of his approach. Even now, facing circumstances that had upended his understanding of our entire relationship, James defaulted to the same manipulative tactics that had defined his career: creating artificial competition, leveraging relationships for personal advancement, positioning himself as uniquely valuable. The realization carried a certain melancholy, not for the relationship lost, but for the recognition that James would likely never change. His fundamental approach to life, to relationships, to professional advancement remained constant regardless of external circumstances. The only difference was that now, finally, I could see his maneuvers with complete clarity, unfiltered by the performances we had both maintained during our marriage. As I turned toward my cabin, I felt not anger but a profound sense of liberation. For 10 years, I had carefully managed James's ego while building something substantial in the shadows. Now, stepping fully into the light of integrated identity, I no longer needed to diminish myself to accommodate his insecurities. Whatever manipulations he attempted going forward would be met with the clear-eyed assessment of a CEO evaluating an ambitious but flawed executive. Nothing more, nothing less. The game he thought he was playing had fundamentally changed. James just hadn't realized it yet. The second day of the retreat dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn morning that made the Adirondacks famous. I woke early, reviewing presentation materials in my cabin while enjoying coffee on the small porch overlooking the lake. The serenity of the setting contrasted sharply with the tension that had defined the previous day's revelations and conversations. My phone chimed with a message from Michael. Breakfast in progress. Everyone present except JC. Housekeeping reports? He cleared out his cabin before dawn. The information wasn't entirely surprising after our conversation by the lake. James had always preferred strategic exits to sustained confrontation. Leaving early allowed him to control the narrative around his departure, rather than facing another day of adjusted power dynamics. Any communication from him? I texted back. Michael's response came quickly. Email to HR at 5:42 a.m. with resignation letter attached. Cited unforeseen personal circumstances and professional conflict of interest. So that was his choice. Rather than adapting to the new reality, James had opted for complete withdrawal, removing himself from a situation where he couldn't dictate the terms of engagement. It was consistent with his pattern. When manipulation failed to produce the desired outcome, retreat and regroup became his preferred strategy. I considered how to address his departure with the executive team. The situation required transparency without unnecessary drama, acknowledgement without amplification. After finishing my coffee, I drafted a brief message to Graham and Michael outlining my approach, then prepared for the day's sessions. The dining room hummed with conversation when I arrived for breakfast. Executives gathered in small groups discussing the previous day's presentations and planned initiatives. Graham approached as I selected fruit from the buffet, his expression carefully neutral. Our director of acquisitions has made a rather abrupt exit, he noted quietly. Anything I should be concerned about from last night's conversation? Nothing unexpected, I replied. James explored the possibility of leveraging our personal history for professional advancement. When that approach wasn't successful, he opted for strategic withdrawal. Graham nodded, unsurprised. And how do you want to handle this with the team? Transparently but efficiently. I'll address it at the beginning of the morning session, then move directly to business matters. The morning meeting began at 9. The conference room arranged as it had been the previous day, though, with one conspicuous empty chair. I opened the session with deliberate calm, addressing the situation directly. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin today's agenda, I want to address a personnel matter. James Caldwell has resigned from his position as Director of Acquisitions, effective immediately. He cited personal circumstances and potential conflicts of interest given the unusual situation that emerged yesterday. I paused, allowing the information to register with the assembled executives. A few exchanged glances, but most maintained professional composure, having already noted his absence at breakfast. Taylor Williams will serve as acting director while we conduct a search for a permanent replacement. Our acquisition strategy remains unchanged, and all ongoing projects will continue as planned. Unless there are immediate questions about transitional arrangements, we'll proceed with today's scheduled discussions. No hands were raised, though I suspected conversations would flourish during the coffee break. With a nod to Michael, I transitioned smoothly to the day's first presentation, effectively closing the topic of James's departure. The remainder of the morning proceeded efficiently, with productive discussions of strategic initiatives and market positioning. If executives were curious about the personal implications of James's resignation, they kept such thoughts private, focusing instead on the business matters at hand. By lunch, the initial curiosity had largely subsided, replaced by the professional engagement that characterized successful leadership retreats. As executives dispersed for the afternoon's breakout sessions, Graham joined me on the lodge's deck, where I had paused to review notes for my closing presentation. "Nicely handled," he commented, settling into the chair beside me, though I must admit I expected more drama from James's departure. "Drama requires an audience," I observed. By leaving at dawn, he deprived himself of that opportunity. Graham nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Patricia tells me Vanessa posted quite the dramatic announcement on social media this morning. Something about toxic workplace dynamics and walking away from situations that don't serve her growth." I smiled slightly at the predictable positioning. Reframing rejection as choice is a time-honored tradition. I wish her well with it. "And James? Do you think he'll pursue that Goldman opportunity he mentioned?" "Perhaps," I said, though I suspect Madison's interest was less substantial than he implied. James has always cultivated the perception of being in demand to strengthen his negotiating position. Graham's expression shifted to one of gentle concern. "And how are you, Rebecca? Not the CEO managing an executive departure, but you personally?" The question caught me off guard. So few people in my life asked about my personal well-being separate from my professional performance. I considered it carefully, wanting to give an honest answer rather than a perfunctory reassurance. "I'm integrating," I said finally. For 10 years, I maintained a deliberate separation between personal and professional identities. That division served its purpose, but it exacted a cost I didn't fully recognize until it ended. "The cost of compartmentalization," Graham nodded. "I've observed it in many successful people, though few maintain it as completely as you did." The separation began as a practical necessity, I explained. Female founders faced distinct challenges when I started Keystone, particularly young women in finance. The dual identity helped bypass certain barriers, but over time, it became something else. A way to maintain a marriage that functioned only when my husband believed he was more successful than his wife. "And now?" Graham asked. "With both the professional secret and the marriage ended?" I gazed out over the lake, considering the question. Now I get to discover who I am without the constant performance, without moderating my achievements to protect someone else's ego, without dividing myself into carefully managed personas. It's simultaneously liberating and unnerving. Graham smiled with genuine warmth. If it helps, those of us who have known both versions have always seen the same fundamental person: brilliant, strategic, and remarkably patient. The integration won't change who you are, only how freely you express it. His words carried the weight of decade-long observation, offering reassurance without platitudes. I appreciated both the sentiment and its delivery, honest assessment rather than empty comfort. "Thank you, Graham," I said simply, "for your perspective and your discretion over the years." As Graham left to join his breakout session, I remained on the deck a few minutes longer, reflecting on the swift, conclusive end of my marriage, James's pre-dawn departure and resignation, without attempting further manipulation or confrontation, represented a clear acknowledgement that the power dynamics had shifted beyond his ability to control. For someone whose career and relationships had been built on carefully managed perceptions, the inability to shape this particular narrative must have been intolerable. My phone buzzed with an incoming email from James's personal account rather than his now-defunct Westbrook address. The subject line read simply, "Forward address for documents." The message itself was brief and impersonal. "Rebecca, please direct any divorce-related documentation to the address below. My attorney will be in touch regarding settlement terms. I've instructed the movers to collect my remaining items from the townhouse next Tuesday between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. If this timing is inconvenient, please advise. James Caldwell, 227 West 77th Street, Apt 16B, New York, NY 1024. The sterile efficiency of the communication, no accusation, no emotion, no reference to our final conversation or his abrupt departure, was quintessential James in retreat mode. When outmaneuvered, he defaulted to cold practicality, treating personal relationships with the same detached efficiency he applied to underperforming investments. I forwarded the message to my attorney with a brief note requesting standard divorce proceedings without punitive measures. Despite the circumstances of our separation, I had no interest in a vindictive settlement. The clean break James had initiated with his public upgrade announcement would continue through an equally clean legal dissolution. As I prepared to join the afternoon sessions, my phone buzzed once more, this time with a text from Sophia at the New York office. Vanessa Lawson called twice requesting meeting with Ms. Mitchell regarding defamatory corporate actions. Declined to elaborate when pressed for details. How would you like to proceed? The predictable escalation brought a small smile to my lips. James might have opted for strategic withdrawal, but Vanessa apparently preferred confrontation, likely positioning herself as defender of his reputation to solidify her role in whatever narrative they were constructing together. No meeting. Necessary, I replied. If she calls again, direct her to HR for any employment-related concerns. For all other matters, my attorney's contact information will suffice. With that final communication boundary established, I tucked my phone away and gathered my materials for the afternoon sessions. The retreat would continue for another day, focused entirely on Westbrook's future strategic positioning. James Caldwell, both as executive and husband, had exited that future through his own deliberate choices. What remained was neither the compartmentalized CEO nor the carefully diminished wife, but simply myself, integrated, clear-eyed, and finally free to build a life without artificial divisions or strategic compromises. The definitive break had come not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet certainty, the natural conclusion to a relationship built on performances that could no longer be maintained once the fundamental truth was revealed. As I walked toward the conference room, I felt lighter than I had in years, unburdened by the weight of dual identities and calibrated self-presentation. Whatever came next, professionally or personally, would be approached as my complete self, without strategic diminishment or calculated moderation. The marriage that had begun with calculated misunderstanding had ended with clarifying truth. In this, at least, there was a certain symmetry, a narrative consistency that even James, with his appreciation for strategic positioning, might grudgingly acknowledge. The weeks following the leadership retreat brought a new rhythm to my life, a recalibration of routines no longer divided between separate identities. I moved through Manhattan as simply myself, attending meetings, making decisions, and navigating professional relationships without the exhausting mental calculations of who knew what about my life. The townhouse James and I had shared felt both empty and liberating. I began small changes, rearranging furniture, replacing artwork chosen for his preferences, converting his home office into a reading room filled with financial texts and economic analyses I'd previously kept at my downtown apartment. The divorce proceedings progressed with surprising efficiency. James, evidently eager to close this chapter quickly, accepted the equitable settlement terms my attorney proposed without protracted negotiation. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed a decade earlier, insisted upon by my family's advisors despite my limited disclosed assets at the time, provided a clean framework for disentanglement. Professional adjustments proved more complex than personal ones. Westbrook's executive team adapted quickly to my integrated identity, but middle management and client relationships required more careful navigation. Decades of gender bias in finance had informed my original decision to operate behind Graham's public-facing chairmanship. Those dynamics hadn't disappeared simply because I had stepped into the light. "The Davidson partners are requesting a meeting with you personally," Michael reported during our weekly status review. Apparently, they have concerns about leadership stability following James's departure. I nodded, unsurprised. "Schedule it for next week. I'll address their concerns directly." "They specifically asked to meet with Mr. Mitchell," Michael added, his expression conveying the awkwardness of the situation. "Then they'll learn something new at our meeting," I replied, simply. "Update the merger documentation to reflect my correct details, but otherwise proceed as planned." Such moments occurred with decreasing frequency as weeks passed, the business world adjusting to the revelation that Elizabeth Mitchell was neither male nor mysterious, but simply a woman who had built something substantial while navigating persistent biases. The professional sphere, however challenging, provided familiar territory. It was the personal wilderness that proved more difficult to traverse. The empty evenings no longer filled with performative dinner parties and strategic networking events. The sudden absence of a decade-long relationship, however flawed it had been. I found myself in an unexpected period of rediscovery, learning to exist as an integrated person after years of careful compartmentalization. Simple decisions, where to dine, what to wear, how to spend a rare free weekend, became exercises in self-knowledge, uncovering preferences I had subjugated for the sake of marital harmony or professional disguise. One Tuesday afternoon, I left the office early, something I rarely did, and walked through Central Park as autumn leaves fell around me. Without conscious decision, I found myself entering the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the place where James and I had first met 8 years ago at a charity gala. I wandered through the galleries with no agenda, absorbing the artwork for pure pleasure, rather than as backdrop for networking. Standing before an abstract expressionist painting I'd always admired, but James had dismissed as pretentious, I experienced a moment of clarity. The compartmentalization that had defined my marriage had begun long before I met James. The dual identities had served a purpose during Keystone's early years, but I had maintained the division far longer than necessary, using James's ego as justification for my own reluctance to fully integrate my life. The truth was uncomfortable but important. I had chosen James precisely because he wouldn't challenge certain barriers I'd erected. His self-absorption had provided convenient cover for my own emotional unavailability. While he had certainly contributed to our marital dysfunction, I had been an equal architect of its fundamental design. 6 weeks after the leadership retreat, on a crisp November evening, I found myself at a small gallery opening in Chelsea, attending not for networking purposes or to accompany James to a client's exhibition, but simply because the artist's work interested me. The freedom of this small choice felt surprisingly significant as I moved through the crowded space, engaging with the art without calculation or performance. "Rebecca Caldwell," a voice said from behind me as I studied a particularly striking canvas. "Or do you prefer Elizabeth Mitchell these days?" I turned to find Patricia Peterson, elegant as always in a beautifully tailored suit, her expression warm with genuine pleasure at our encounter. "Either works," I replied with a smile. "Though I'm finding Rebecca feels more natural outside. The office." Patricia nodded, understanding the subtle distinction. "It's good to see you in a setting like this," she said, gesturing to the gallery. Graham mentioned you've been working rather relentlessly since the retreat. There's been a lot to manage, I acknowledged. But tonight I'm just here for the art. As am I, Patricia said, linking her arm through mine with casual warmth. Though I must confess a personal connection, the artist is my niece. Would you like an introduction? The offer held no agenda, no strategic networking potential, nothing beyond simple human connection. I accepted with genuine pleasure, allowing Patricia to guide me through the crowd toward a young woman gesturing animatedly to a small group of admirers. The evening unfolded with unexpected ease. Conversations about art and creative process. A glass of wine shared with Patricia as we discussed books we'd recently enjoyed, an invitation to join the Petersons for dinner the following week, with absolutely no business talk allowed. As my driver navigated back toward the Upper East Side later that evening, I found myself reflecting on the curious liberation of simple social interaction without the constant mental calculations of separate identities. The professional gains of integration were significant, but the personal relief was profound. No longer maintaining elaborate fictions or careful compartmentalization, simply existing as myself in all contexts. James had intended the anniversary dinner as my ending, a public diminishment designed to establish his ascendance and my irrelevance. Instead, it had become a beginning, the catalyst for integration I had avoided for years. In discarding me as insufficient, he had inadvertently freed me to become more completely myself than I had been in a decade. The wilderness period wasn't about being lost, I realized as the car pulled up to my townhouse. It was about finding my way to a self no longer divided against itself for someone else's comfort. The path forward remained uncertain in many respects, but for the first time in years, I was walking it as a whole person, not Rebecca or Elizabeth, but simply myself, undivided and undiminished. 3 months after the leadership retreat, winter had settled over Manhattan, transforming the city, with pristine snow that quickly surrendered to urban reality. The holiday season arrived with its customary frenzy, though this year I approached it with a freedom I hadn't experienced in a decade. No carefully choreographed corporate parties where I played the role of supportive spouse, no strategic gift, exchanges with James's colleagues and their wives. The divorce had been finalized with remarkable speed. The clean terms of our prenuptial agreement and James's eagerness to conclude matters expediting a process that often dragged on for years. My attorney reported that he had accepted all standard provisions without negotiation, his signature on the final documents arriving mere hours after they were delivered to his new address. It seems Mr. Caldwell is quite motivated to move forward, she observed during our final meeting. Moving forward has always been James's preference, I replied, particularly when the past becomes inconvenient. Professional life had stabilized as well. The Davidson merger had successfully closed despite initial concerns about leadership changes, my direct handling of their executive team effectively addressing questions about Westbrook's stability. The market had responded positively to the acquisition, with our stock price rising steadily through the fourth quarter. More significantly, I had begun reshaping Westbrook's organizational culture now that I was fully visible as its leader. The RC, carefully structured hierarchy James had attempted to navigate, had been flattened in key areas, creating more direct communication channels between innovation teams and executive leadership. Talent that had previously been overlooked, particularly women in middle management positions, was being recognized and advanced based on demonstrated capabilities rather than political connections. The quarterly results are exceeding projections by nearly 8%, Michael reported during our year-end review, and employee satisfaction metrics are up across all departments. And external perception? I asked, knowing the financial world's skepticism about female leadership remained an unspoken reality. Increasingly positive, Michael confirmed. The Davidson success story has helped considerably. Your profile in Financial Times last month positioned Westbrook as innovative precisely because of your unconventional leadership approach. The professional validation was gratifying, But it was the personal transformations that most surprised me. Without the constant performance of being James's wife, a role that had required careful modulation of my intelligence, ambition, and capabilities, I discovered aspects of myself that had been suppressed for years. I joined a women's investment group I had previously avoided for fear of being recognized, finding unexpected camaraderie with other female executives navigating similar challenges. I enrolled in advanced quantum computing courses at Columbia, exploring technologies that would reshape financial markets in coming decades. I even began rock climbing at an indoor facility near my office, the physical challenges providing a welcome counterbalance to intellectual demands. Most significantly, I reconnected with family and friends who had been carefully compartmentalized during my marriage. My cousin Emma, once my closest confidant before James had subtly discouraged the relationship, visited from Boston for a weekend that reminded me how much I had missed authentic connection. "I hardly recognize this version of you," she said, as we shared wine in my newly redecorated living room. "You seem unburdened." "I spent 10 years carrying the weight of other people's expectations," I acknowledged. James's need to feel superior, the market's biases about female leadership, my own fears about being fully seen. Putting those down has been surprisingly liberating. Emma studied me thoughtfully. "Have you heard from him? Since everything was finalized?" "Not directly," I said, "though I understand from industry contacts that he's taken a position with a boutique firm in Chicago, smaller than his previous roles, but with an impressive title." "Typical," Emma snorted. "Always prioritizing appearances over substance." "It's who he is," I said without rancor. "Status has always been James's primary currency. I don't fault him for it anymore. I just recognize it's fundamentally incompatible with my values." What I didn't share with Emma was the fleeting moment of reflection I'd experienced upon learning of James's relocation. Not regret for our ended marriage, but acknowledgement that we had both been playing roles that ultimately served neither of us well. His public discard of me had been cruel and calculating, but it had also freed me from a performance I might otherwise have maintained indefinitely. In early February, I attended the annual Global Finance Summit in Zurich, my first time participating as the public face of Westbrook rather than operating behind Graham Peterson's chairmanship. The event gathered industry leaders for 3 days of panels, presentations, and the inevitable networking that shaped financial relationships worldwide. During a morning break between sessions, I found myself approached by Madison Lambert, the Goldman executive James had name-dropped during our confrontation at the leadership retreat. "Rebecca Caldwell," she said, extending her hand with professional warmth, "or Elizabeth Mitchell, depending on which business card you're using today." I accepted the handshake with a genuine smile, appreciating the directness. "Just Rebecca is fine. It's good to finally meet you, Madison. Your work on algorithmic trading regulation has been groundbreaking." "As has your stealth approach to building Westbrook," she countered with approval, "though I imagine maintaining separate identities became rather exhausting." "More than I recognized until it ended," I acknowledged. Madison nodded thoughtfully, then hesitated before continuing. "I hope you don't mind my mentioning this, but James Caldwell contacted me several months ago, leveraging your name rather aggressively to secure a meeting." "That doesn't surprise me," I replied evenly. "Leveraging connections has always been a cornerstone of James's professional strategy." "I gathered that," Madison said dryly, "which is why I declined the meeting. Anyone who needs to name-drop their spouse to get an appointment isn't bringing substantive value to the table." The observation was astute and unsentimental, exactly the clear-eyed assessment I had been unable to make while maintaining my marital performance. "Your instincts were sound," I confirmed, "though I believe he's found a position that better appreciates his particular talents." Madison smiled with professional understanding. "The market eventually prices all assets appropriately," she observed, the financial maxim serving as elegant commentary on both business and personal valuation. Our conversation shifted to industry, trends and potential collaborations, the brief discussion of James falling away as naturally as our marriage had. The interaction left me with a curious sense of completion, professional recognition of my capabilities, without the shadow of a husband who had once claimed credit for connections he hadn't realized were actually mine. That evening, at the Summit's formal dinner, I found myself seated at a table with global financial leaders I had previously encountered only through carefully managed intermediaries. The conversations flowed with intellectual rigor and professional respect, my contributions valued without the discounting I had often experienced when operating through male proxies. As I glanced around the ornate ballroom, taking in the concentrated, financial power represented in the room, I realized how fundamentally my perspective had shifted. Where once I had navigated such spaces with careful calculation, managing perceptions, guarding my identity, moderating my capabilities to maintain James's ego, I now moved through them with straightforward confidence, neither diminishing nor exaggerating my presence. The woman who had once constructed elaborate divisions to protect both a husband's fragile ego and her own professional ambitions had been replaced by someone integrated and whole. A leader comfortable in her capabilities, neither apologizing for her success nor weaponizing it against others. James had intended his upgrade announcement as my diminishment. Instead, it had become my emancipation. Freedom not just from a marriage built on performance, but from the compartmentalization that had limited my own growth far more than I had recognized. 1 year to the day after James had introduced Vanessa as his upgrade at our anniversary dinner, I found myself back at the same restaurant, not by sentimental design or painful coincidence, but because Graham Peterson had selected it for our quarterly off-site strategic planning dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stepped through the familiar entrance, but the sharp sting of humiliation that had once accompanied those memories had faded to a dull acknowledgement of life's curious symmetries. The restaurant had changed little in the intervening year. The same ambient lighting, elegant decor, and attentive staff creating an atmosphere of understated luxury. What had changed profoundly was me. I walked through the space not as James, Caldwell's carefully modulated wife, but as Elizabeth Mitchell Caldwell. I had recently reclaimed my full name, integrating both identities legally as I had personally, CEO of a thriving financial institution and a woman fully comfortable in her own power. Ms. Mitchell Caldwell, the maitre d' greeted me with professional deference. Your party is all ready, seated in the private dining room. As I followed him through the main dining area toward our reserved space, a familiar figure at the bar caught my eye. Not James, as some novelistic coincidence might have dictated, but Vanessa. She sat alone, elegant as ever in a designer dress, absently checking her phone while apparently waiting for someone. Our eyes met briefly as I passed. Her expression shifted from surprise to careful neutrality, her chin lifting slightly in what might have been defiance or simple acknowledgement. I nodded politely without breaking stride, neither avoiding the encounter nor giving it more significance than it deserved. The executive dinner proceeded productively, Westbrook's leadership, team discussing expansion opportunities and technological investments with the engaged focus that had become our hallmark. I had rebuilt the executive ranks thoughtfully over the past year, promoting talent based on demonstrated capabilities rather than political connections, creating a team notable for both its diversity and its results. The Asian market's expansion is exceeding projections by nearly 12%, our new director of acquisitions reported, a talented woman who had been overlooked during James's brief tenure, but whose strategic insights had proven invaluable since her promotion. The board is extremely pleased with our performance this quarter, Graham added, particularly the innovation pipeline you've established with the quantum computing initiative. The discussion continued, focused entirely on future possibilities, rather than past achievements. It was this forward orientation that had always driven me professionally, even when personal circumstances had required elaborate compartmentalization to maintain it. As our dinner concluded and executives began dispersing, Graham lingered behind, his expression thoughtful. "Quite a year," he observed once we were alone. "Westbrook has transformed under your visible leadership." "Evolution rather than transformation," I corrected gently. "The vision was always there. What changed was simply who articulated it." Graham nodded, acknowledging the distinction. "And, personally, how has that evolution progressed?" The question was offered with genuine care rather than curiosity, reflecting the friendship that had deepened beyond professional mentorship over the past year. "Integration continues," I replied, honestly. "Some days more successfully than others, but the performance aspects have largely fallen away." "Good," Graham said simply. "That performance was never necessary for those who truly saw you." As we made our way toward the exit, I noticed Vanessa still at the bar, now joined by a man I didn't recognize. Younger than James, expensively dressed with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to attention. They were clearly in the early stages of attraction, their body language conveying mutual interest as they leaned toward each other, sharing confidences over cocktails. The scene triggered not jealousy but a curious sense of recognition. Vanessa, following a pattern I understood intimately, seeking partnership with someone whose status and ambition mirrored her own aspirations. The difference was that her upgrade from James had apparently been as calculated as his had been from me, each moving toward relationships that better served their fundamental needs for status and validation. Outside, as we waited for our respective cars, Graham nodded toward the restaurant entrance. "Wasn't that—" "Yes," I confirmed simply. "Life's little symmetries." "And James? Any word on how he's faring in Chicago?" "Advancing rapidly within a smaller sphere," I said. "Regional vice. President within 8 months. He's always been skilled at navigating organizational hierarchies." What I didn't share was the brief email I'd received from James 2 months earlier. Not an apology or attempt at reconciliation, but a carefully worded request for professional reference regarding a potential client who had mentioned knowing me. The message had been formal, almost aseptically so, with no acknowledgement of our shared history beyond a perfunctory, "I hope this finds you well." I had provided the requested information with equal professionalism, maintaining the boundaries his actions had established. His response, a brief, "Thank you for your assistance," suggested he had found some equilibrium in his new circumstances, though whether he had gained any insight from our unraveling remained unclear. Graham's car arrived first, and with a warm handshake, he departed for the evening. Left alone on the sidewalk, I found myself reflecting on the perfect circularity of the moment. Standing outside the same restaurant where, 1 year earlier, James had orchestrated what he believed would be my public diminishment. The cool evening. Air carried hints of approaching spring, the seasonal shift promising renewal after winter's necessary dormancy. I breathed it in deeply, appreciating the moment's symbolism without being constrained by it. The past year had taught me that narratives were tools, not prisons, useful for making sense of experience, but dangerous when they limited future possibilities. My own car arrived, the driver holding the door with professional courtesy. As I settled into the back seat, my phone chimed with an incoming message. Not from James or anyone connected to my past, but from Dr. Eleanor West, the quantum computing specialist I had recently recruited to lead Westbrook's most ambitious technological initiative. "Breakthrough with the algorithmic model this evening. Results exceeding all projections. Can we meet first thing tomorrow to discuss implications?" I smiled at the timing, the forward-looking message arriving precisely as I departed this place of completed history. "Absolutely. My office, 7 a.m. Bring the full data set." As the car pulled away from the curb, I glanced back once at the restaurant. Not with regret or nostalgia, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of distance traveled. The woman who had sat frozen in humiliation at that anniversary dinner no longer existed, not because she had been destroyed by public rejection, but because she had finally been integrated into something more complete. James had introduced his upgrade exactly 1 year ago, never suspecting that his calculated cruelty would ultimately free me from the performance that had limited us both. In discarding me for someone he believed better served his ambitions, he had inadvertently catalyzed the integration I had avoided for years, the merging of Elizabeth Mitchell's professional power with Rebecca Caldwell's personal presence. The true upgrade, it turned out, had been neither his new relationship nor my professional revelation, but simply this: the freedom to exist as my complete self, undivided and undiminished by others' expectations. As Manhattan's lights blurred past the car windows, I opened my tablet to review Dr. West's preliminary findings, my mind already engaged with tomorrow's possibilities rather than yesterday's completed narratives. James had intended our anniversary dinner as an ending, the conclusion of a wife who no longer served his purposes. Instead, it had become a beginning, the first step toward a self no longer fragmented for someone else's comfort. The symmetry of tonight's encounter with Vanessa felt less like cosmic significance and more like simple closure. The final page of a chapter already concluded, allowing the story to progress toward what came next. And what came next, I realized with quiet certainty, would be shaped entirely by my own integrated voice. Neither the carefully modulated wife nor the strategically hidden CEO, but the woman who would emerge from the intersection of both, carrying forward the wisdom each perspective had provided. James had orchestrated my public humiliation as a demonstration of his power. He could not have known that in doing so, he was actually returning mine, the power to exist completely as myself, without strategic diminishment or calculated performance. In the final accounting, his attempt to showcase his upgrade had revealed something far more valuable: the recognition that I had never needed upgrading at all, only the courage to stand fully in the light as exactly who I was. That courage, once found, had transformed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.